Welcome to the Melanin Marvels podcast. We are your hosts. My name is Adrian.
And I'm Anika.
And I'm Divi.
And today's conversation will be centered around X-Men, in particular, the Mutant Minority Metaphor, and some of the parallels and contrasts between Professor X and Magneto with civil rights leaders Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. But first, let's start off with a bit of background.
Okay, so we're gonna give you a bit of background on X-Men and the way that the story kind of developed. So the first X-Men title appeared in 1963 when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were first building up the Marvel lineup. And they decided to create a team of superheroes who were born with super abilities instead of, being bitten by a radioactive spider or things like this. So the original team that they created of these superheroes stayed around for a few years, but eventually fell away. Then in 1975, a new cast appeared in the pages of giant-sized X-Men. It was created by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. The new X-Men made a splash in the comic industry, and it wasn't confined to just one title anymore. It became the X-Men family. So with this X-Men family, they started gaining a real following and started gaining a lot of popularity. So what accounted for their popularity? There were a few reasons. Part of it was that from the beginning, like a lot of teenage audiences, the mutants are easy to identify with. In the Marvel universe, mutants are just like everyone else until they hit puberty and they're going through all these emotional and physical changes and like mutant changes, and they aren't connecting with their parents and obviously, not with society either. So there is a bit of that, like a feeling of alienation that a lot of teenagers could identify with. But what we're going to focus on is the mutant minority metaphor, which is another important aspect, and if not like a vital aspect of the series, and accounts for a lot of the X-Men series' popularity. So the X-Men series encompass themes of prejudice and bigotry. So Stan Lee and Jack Kirby stated that the dominant theme of the narrative is to condemn prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, things like that. So in the X-Men series, and all the mutants are often hated because they were born different from humans. And Stan Lee says that he wanted to spotlight a group of innocent people who were feared and shunned and later hunted and persecuted. And he wanted to show that anyone, no matter how blameless, can be victimized in this way. And so Chris Claremont, who later takes on the series, felt the same way and started writing the series with the mindset that the X-Men are hated, feared, despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they are mutants. And this they were connecting this mutant identity to minority identities, specifically in regards to Black civil rights and that the entire movement and how Black people were being persecuted in that way. So we're going to dive into that a little deeper. Okay, so with that bit of background into X-Men, I guess I'll throw it to one of you. How do we feel about the mutant minority metaphor, how it plays out?
Well, I'll just get started by saying that I could definitely appreciate the connection that creators have done for, I guess, allowing folks who are feeling who are part of minorities to identify with the struggles that the mutants face, and that's an ongoing sort of narrative that's throughout the entire X-Men series. I can appreciate it for that. I think the more I think about it, the more it feels like a very rough idea that could use some work or more like intention into it. Like in particularly looking into some of the complexities of like being a minority, or how the sort of metaphor itself sort of brands like all sort of minorities having the same sort of experience of oppression when that isn't the case. And I think that while on one end, I think you could talk about how mutant abilities are sort of displayed and how they're shown, while some folks are, passing, some aren't. I think it becomes a bit rough when you try to make an exact comparison to, okay, if you're a minority as someone who is Black versus someone who's another part of minority, or even like the intersections of minorities as well, and talking about that and how that affects someone's lived experience. So I think it's a great idea, but I think more intention, and even to this day, being able to find more opportunities to explore that metaphor more, I guess, thoughtfully, would help it sort of advance the sort of subject line that they're going for.
Yeah, I feel, because when the X-Men first came out, it was what, the 70s, the 80s, no, 60s,
late 60s, and then revamped in mid 70s.
So in that time period, people were looking at like race as just a black or white issue.
Yeah.
So those other people of color were a non-factor. So if we're comparing it to now, where you have more of that, like those issues then, where it was either if you were anything other than Black or people of color, like you would still fit under the umbrella of that. And like nowadays, they are in the comics and stuff, they're giving more, like they're shedding more light onto the different characters, the same way that in reality those other people of color are like having that light shed onto them. And it's the same way as before we were all grouped together as POC, like people of color, and now we are more using the term BIPOC, like BIPOC, for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we're able to have more freedom within our umbrella. And I guess in the comics, they're doing that too.
You know, two things. It's interesting that you said that, because I think you're like very right in, I think during that time, if you weren't white, you were just kind of like pushed into other and like absorbed, at least in North America, absorbed into like the Black population. So if you weren't white, you were just over here. And I think that's like, this mutant minority is a reflection of that, because there is no intersectionality. Also, I think, and this is the thing with the X-Men, like they live in a world, like this is an allegorical world. Like they don't say anything about the actual civil rights movement. Like they don't like function in like the real world, whereas other Marvel comic books do, right? They reference things that actually happened historically, but the X-Men series doesn't. And that's interesting, because they just focus obviously on what they're facing. But I think that's kind of like, not an erasure, but you know, a departure. There are disconnects because of that.
There's disconnects, but then on the other hand, that could be a reason why people choose to like delve into the world, because it's like a way to forget about the problems that you're actually facing in the world and just like live the experience of these fictional characters in their fictional world.
Yeah, I think even in addition to that, I think that's a great point, Gibby, because I think, once again, intersection, it'd be very interesting. I don't know when it comes to like historically X-Men, when folks, I guess like when mutants became not mainstream, but when folks have been like more openly like mutant, but how that would take into play during like the civil rights movement or during some of these like keystone pieces in history are very cool things that I think they've dropped the ball in really exploring, because that in itself, like historically, if that was a thing, I would be interested to know what happens. My grand theory right now is that the only thing that's going to solve like folks when it comes to, not about only thing, I think one thing that could solve like people sort of being able to unify is aliens. It'd be some sort of like external factor that folks could like identify as the other to sort of connect with, and that's mutants. That's legit mutants. So I think it'd be very interesting to explore how mutants take into play with some of the things that have happened and even continue to happen to this day. So there's a bit of a lost opportunity there, but I think, as you mentioned, Nika, it's almost safer to sort of have like this sort of world where it looks like the world that we live in, but you sort of mute some of those pieces that make some readers uncomfortable to
And I mean, it's written, I feel like, when it at least started, it is a product of its time, shall we say. I think that's one of the main problems, that it didn't develop as the world did. You know what I mean? Like, those narratives could have gained depth. Before we continue, I feel like we should put out some disclaimers. We are going to do a part 2 of this video later, that will be addressing the Americanization, the Eurocentrism that is embedded into the X-Men Mutant Minority Metaphor. We'll address that in a later video. I think for what they, while it is a product of its time, I think it's important to highlight that, yeah, you know, it could be a story about just like a kid feeling alienated, but that like that minority metaphor, that minority piece, it is in there because of the way minority people are persecuted in North America. So I feel like it's important to highlight that, and that's what we're doing today. Also, because aliens, I think that would be like, and this has happened in other series, like that's like immigration. They actually touch on those things, but that's for a different time. I just wanted to share that.
That's going to be a different episode.
Altogether.
Different issue.
But it's cool. Like, I like when they do that. I think it especially for BIPOC people, when like those issues are very, at least for me, like it's very personal for us. And I like when they put it into that superhero world.
An example of that within the X-Men could be Nightcrawler, because he's not American. The whole within the mutantdom or mutanthood or whatever it's called, how within that some people have the option of being able to pass as not mutant. So like Nightcrawler cannot. Like Nightcrawler, you look at him, you see he's a mutant. But
blue tail, scales, yeah.
But somebody like Xavier or Jean Grey or Rogue or even Storm, they could just pass as just a normal human when they're not using their powers.
I always wondered this, because okay, so like Nightcrawler and then Beast, obviously like later in the series,
and
Colossus, the people that couldn't pass as like normal, at least like, because Nightcrawler is it's a very visual representation of like, this is a person who cannot hide their mutantness, you know, they can't hide that part of their physical identity. Like I do wish that they like explored that more. I do think that like, because they had a whole movie, one of the movies, it was Days of Future Past, right, where they were trying to create the serum.
Honestly, I can't remember because I can't keep those movies straight in my head.
Okay, so yeah, Adrian, I don't know if you want to look
I
it
think
up.
it is Days of Future Past.
Okay. So Days of Future Past, the entire premise was that they were trying to create a serum to like make it so their mutantness wasn't visible, and that was the whole theme. And I think obviously limited, I think they did like a good job of like introducing the concept of like passing and like working through it, because who was it? What's her name? The one that can switch.
Kitty Pride? Oh, Mystique,
yeah. So like they were trying to like get her cells so they can like create a thing, and so they can hide their mutantness. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I as a minority, there's a part of my life, or a long part of my life, where I didn't want to be brown, because there were a lot of negative things and like hurt and like a lot of things that came with it. And I feel like, I don't know, I thought it was a good depiction. They were like going through that.
I mean, not wanting to be brown is also very much steeped in your culture, with the whole Fair and Lovely bleaching creams and stuff, and like not wanting to procreate with somebody darker than you because you want lighter children.
Because we're taught white is right.
Yeah. So it's just very much a part of like the culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think like definitely like even outside of like, so like I'm Sri Lankan, but even outside this like Sri Lankan community, well, they don't know. So
say it loud and say it proud, Divi.
But so even outside the Sri Lankan community, because here I grew up in a lot of white spaces, and like it was all, my brownness was always stated. Like they needed either make fun of it or point it out or something, and you're always like, you can't, and it like, you know, even with the Fair and Lovely, yeah, like sure, when I was younger, I'm not gonna lie, like I used that because I wanted to be fair, because that's what pretty was, that's what accepted was here. And so I feel like for them, the like equivalent would be that anecdote, or the whatever, the, not potion, what's it called?
Serum.
There we go. To like make themselves appear human.
I think you've touched on everything. I think it's coming from personal experience. I know within like Jamaican culture, that's something similar as well, and folks just gravitating more towards like being lighter in complexion, and sort of the ostracization of folks who are darker in complexion as well. I feel, and I don't have the words for it right now, but there's a part of me that feels like there is, I think the one thing that it's missing, and I don't expect Marvel to dive into this, is like there is the differentiation between like folks who look white versus folks who are like POCs of color, and that distinction. And I don't know how the serum would do this, but it's also like the complexities comes to like shadeism as well, as you were talking about, which serum wise, I don't know how that would really reflect or play into what it talks about or dives into. Unless it's the idea of like they're a mutant, but they're passing in some certain way as opposed to another. But I think there's still a bit of a complexity there, because I don't think I've seen within the movies that mutants react to other mutants who look different a certain way. Like I don't think I've seen that. So that could also be something to potentially explore in a narrative or a storyline or something. But there's a part of me, I enjoyed that sort of piece for Beast, because he was like usually like the very like intellectual character. It doesn't really something anything phases with him, but also you don't really see his character develop much. So that whole arc when it comes to like First Class and all that, I like that, especially contrasting him with Mystique, and that how that character arc goes as well. For both of them was very interesting and well done. But I feel like there's still something else there that I feel like Marvel could dive into as to that could reflect, be an equivalent or metaphor for like shadeism.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there was an actual inclusion of BIPOC people, like obviously they would be able to attack it more or present it more authentically. But with, you know, I don't know if you remember, but the scene where Beast and Mystique are talking, and he's like, you know, talking to her about how they're building the serum or whatever, and then he says something that like hurts her, is something in the vein of like, oh, like you look the most beautiful when you look like Jennifer Lawrence, like, you know, pretty blonde, whatever, white lady. And because that was his goal, for all of them to reflect that image. And I feel like at one time or another, a BIPOC person has felt that, you know?
Like, definitely, because it goes back to the whole, like, you look better when your hair's straight. Like curly hair is not good. Like straighten your hair, you look better. Or like, oh, you look better without your glasses. Or like the whole, like, every single teen movie where the girl goes through a transformation. She starts out with curly hair and glasses, and when she becomes pretty, glasses are gone, hair straight. Like, what is that saying to little girls with curly hair and bad eyes?
I remember when I watched that scene, I was like, oh, why? Just because Mystique is like, I mean, I know she's like one of the bad guys, but like she's awesome, like she's badass. and like he was supposed to be like, you know, like in the movie, like falling in love with her, but then he says that and I'm like, oh, I feel like it punched me in the gut, you know.
I'm going to take a bit of an aside here. I don't think Escapes of Future's Past. This is kind of bothering me right now.
I think it is.
Look it up.
Also, I'm trying to look it up right now. I think it might be First Class. It might be in the first movie.
Oh, it might be First Class. I think it is First Class.
Yeah.
You're correct. You are correct. Yes.
I was just Googling, not Google, I was YouTubing at the side while you were talking. I was like, figure this out. We need to source this correctly.
You are correct, sir. Make sure you include this correction because it's true. Okay. It is. Yeah, that was my bad.
I told you, all of these movies, they just go like this in my brain. They're all the same.
Yeah, I swear. I mean, I still love them all.
So one question I have when it comes to the metaphor, when it comes to the mutant minority metaphor, do either of you recall like a particular episode or moment, like Div, you talked about like the Beast moment. Were there any other episodes or even comics that you've seen that did a good job of sort of emphasizing this metaphor?
Yeah, I don't know, Anika, if you want to go or if you want me.
I'm trying to think of.
Yeah, I think they did a well-meaning white people did a good job. Meaning, they couldn't really possibly know what it means to be a minority, not really. And with the audience that they were creating for, they did what they did. It was very apparent to me that this was about like an oppressed group of people. But of course, there were nuances lost because whatever it is, this is white people white people who are part of the dominant group in society telling a story about an oppressed group of society. So well-meaning white people did what they did with what they had, or let them box themselves in tab.
I'm trying to like cheat here and look it up. I'm seeing the racial politics of the X-Men. All oppression is the same. That's myth number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Or myth 2 is an oppressed group is in some way responsible for its own oppression.
Mm.
Find that a lot in real life where they're like, well, Black people just oppress themselves.
Okay, you know what, actually? So I found that a lot too, that there was, and I don't know, we can jump back to like the original point, but there was like, because the reason, the humans are scared of mutants is because they have powers and they could destroy them. And if we look at history, I think about the Rodney King case. Okay, in LA, Adrian, you're familiar? Okay. So there were I think there were 6 or 7 officers that beat him down. And this held up in court, what I'm about to say. They said that they were so afraid of the threat of a Black man because he was going to develop superhuman strength and take them all out, that they needed to enact that type of violence. And this held up in court. And honestly, I look at things like that, and this happened time and time again in North America, and honestly probably around the world as well, where Black people were viewed as these superhuman brutes to justify violence on them. And I feel like the way minorities are subject to violence and regulation and things like that, and obviously not in the same way, but those parallels are there.
Yeah, you make a great point there, and great case example too. Generally speaking, I think, and something that you're touching on as well, when it comes to that relationship between humans and mutants, for sure, that contrast and that sort of fear and how that translates to modern society and reaction, whether it be of the police or other sort of oppressive forces that are out there. Definitely there's this sort of savagery that's associated, that translates on both ends. And I think even that, and I keep touching on this, where I feel like there are a lot of opportunities to dive into these things. So it makes me wonder now, how intentional it is, but also how much are writers continuing to dive into this metaphor, especially if it's something that was like so important in sort of emphasizing in their stories. Like, I know it might be I may be jumping ahead a bit, but with intention. I think it might have been like the first movie where they made some parallels with, like, Martin Luther King and Magneto, or Martin Luther King with Professor X, Magneto with why am I messing this up? Magneto with Malcolm X in particular is the parallel I'm trying to draw into right now. And Magneto had like a quote or something he said, where it's like, the human mutant war is coming and I intend to fight it by any means necessary, like, quote there, which, cool. Like, that was made with the intention to make that line there. And I think by making it very straightforward as to where things are happening now to this day and how it relates, and being very directly in your face about it, would help in making those connections more. Because otherwise, there's people getting a very, like, cookie cutter basic perception of what it means to be oppressed, or they're able to sort of dissociate that in thinking, okay, they have powers, that's why this is happening, so that's it when it comes to the metaphor for me. On, like, I'll say plus, but it's on the meta end. On the other end, I'm jumping ahead here, but I feel like I had to, because I was looking this up and I was like, I was kind of shook. There was a comic that was out there that did an interesting, I guess, like, tried to do an interesting parallel between, like, mutants and, like, race. So this was in 1982's X-Men God Loves, Man Kills. In the issue, it revolved around Kitty Pride. And Kitty was, like, beating up a kid in her, like, ballet class for insulting mutants, and they used, like, a derogatory term for mutants at the time. A black woman approached her. I can't remember if it was, like, a teacher, or I think it might have been a ballet teacher. Approached her and said, like, it's just a word. In which Kitty Pride responded by using the N-word. And
oh my god!
Well,
it was fully printed.
I'm pretty sure I could show you the picture. I'm gonna say we'll have a link to the photo in our video in some way. Here you go.
Oh my god.
Hard-er.
Yeah, hard-er indeed. So, like, there's a piece here, and I think there was, like, a response here as well, right? And so this is what happened. I think it was, like, Kitty's parents talking to the ballet teacher. And, yeah. And I think how it's weird, because, like, I see what they're trying to do here. I see what they're trying to do. And I think in itself, when you have a comic that tries to go into making this sort of, like, mutant metaphor, but then has someone who is white sort of, like, try to make that parallel themselves, I see what they're trying to do, but it almost acts like you're taking, like, a shuffle forward, but then, like, leaping back a couple decades in execution. And forgetting, like, the history itself, like, what you're triggering to your readers in doing that, but then trying to have Kitty Pryde think, oh, this is how I feel, this is how I'm feeling oppressed, but then oppressing your readers, oppressing your colored readers.
Yeah.
It's So that it's things like this that I observe, or I could see here, where I don't know. I think it's like a huge problem in not being like very intentional and mindful about how you're having these conversations, whether it be you're neglecting it or you're trying to spark the dialogue for it, but then do it poorly, i.e. here. And I feel like from what I've heard, I'll edit this out if I can't find the proof for it. But I feel like this isn't the only time that Kitty has used the N-word, at least in this art, in this comic, potentially. I'll edit that out if I'm wrong, but that was one thing that stood out.
I kind of think this speaks to, we touched on this like last episode as well, like the invisibility of whiteness. They don't consider like white is neutral, so they can do whatever they want. Like they can identify with an oppressed group because you can do whatever with a white identity. You know what I mean? Like, whereas obviously we now know that like cultural identities there is that those have meaning, and like this obviously, I don't know, I feel like if there were BIPOC people in that writer's room, this would not have happened with a little white girl saying this to a
I'm mad confused because Kitty Pride legit has done this multiple times.
Oh, really?
Into it now, yes. Marvel. First of all, why are you throwing this little girl under the bus like that, making her the one to say it all the time? And why are you making somebody say it all the time? What? I
swear white people are just itching to say that word whenever they can. I swear to God.
So I think I keep saying this. But I feel like I need to say it. Where it is important. Like I think on one end, having the intention to have this sort of conversation, just in general, when it comes to this metaphor, is like a great step. But without actively doing the research as writers and creating these stories, it's almost irresponsible to put yourself out there as trying to have these sort of conversations or parallels without understanding the nuance on one point, but also the complexities.
No, it is definitively irresponsible. But I feel like we'll touch on that, like, you know, when we talk about the whiteness of it all as well. Do you think, because now like we kind of like talked about the like writers as well and the intentions when they're creating these things, because, you know, obviously there's a difference between like the X-Men and then Magneto's group,
Brotherhood of Mutants.
Yeah. Do you like, because I was looking at that and they very much obviously there's they want you to support, like, you know, because Professor X, this whole thing is like integration, like he wants peaceful blah blah blah. That's great, and of course that is great, that is good. But the way they write all the mutants that are on Magneto's side, it's like as if, because and I think this, we saw this even in today's world, where the white narrative is that, oh, all these oppressed people are going to react violently, and that's how Magneto and his people are depicted. Do you think, like, what do you think about that they wrote those mutants as reacting violently?
Well, because Magneto is based on Malcolm X, right? And like everybody always looks at Malcolm as the more violent one and Martin as the peacekeeper, where Malcolm's like by any means necessary, like use what force you need to, because they're going to be using force against you. So I guess they're trying to depict that through there.
Well, also, like, I kind of like, that's very much an essentialization of Malcolm X, because, like, sure, you know, for him it was by any means or necessary, but that wasn't all he was, and that wasn't all he was preaching. And I feel like
I definitely feel like for both of them, everything is very generalized and like sensationalized, because most of the people who are like, oh, Martin Luther King, if he was still alive today and he were doing this, a lot of people would be against him.
Yeah.
These same people who be wearing his face on their shirts and sweaters and be making posts, if you were alive the same time as him, you probably would not be a supporter of him. Or
goddamn colonizers.
Or even same way for Malcolm X, a lot of people were like, oh, X and stuff. Like you probably would not have liked him.
I kind of like, I was thinking about this in terms of, so let's just even look at like one of the movies. I think probably it was the first one where like everybody was like, Magneto's trying to kill all humans and this, that, and the other. The uproar that receives, I kind of look at it, you know, when all the protests were happening after George Floyd's passing, you know, and then the media focused on the riots, which, like, I looked into it, it was only 6% of what was going on that was riots, and the rest, like the 94%, was protests. But the media made it seem like the dominant, and the media made it seem like the dominant, the prominent, the most like the single reaction from Black people was that they were being violent and ruining all these businesses. But it was a very, very small portion, and wasn't even like mostly Black people that were even in that 6% of riots. So I feel like the attention, like, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, they're saying that this is how minority people will react, when in all reality that is not the case. Not even when we saw, because most of it was protests, and most of it is, like, even in the X-Men story, integration. But they're focusing on, this is how, if you keep doing this to minority people, they're gonna fuck you up. But that's not historically, and even in the movies, is not entirely the case.
Or even it's also like the whole spin of the story, where, because like if you're going to compare it to what we're dealing with now, a lot of people feel like if you say Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, that means that the other lives don't matter. So it's like, if you're saying like you stand up for something, then it's like you're saying kill all of those other people. Like, no, we're just trying to get our, like, we're just trying to get our recognition and what we deserve.
Yeah.
Not like take away, or like the same thing with the whole defund the police thing. It's not that the police are not going to be getting any money anymore. Like, the police still are going to get money to function in the way that they should. It's just that they're saying that these other things need funding, and don't give all the funding to the police.
I feel like the like oppressors, whether it be in the mutant world or even our world, there is a thought that, like, they think if because they have violated the oppressed, that the oppressed are going to react to them in that same way. But the oppressed don't want to use the tools of the oppressors, and they don't understand that. I feel like even in the movie they depict like Magneto and the rest of them like so evil, but that's not how oppressed people, like, historically, realistically react. Of course, yes, of course we're angry, but we're not trying to be like our oppressors.
Exactly. Like, if you use the example of Canada's Indigenous people, obviously the white people were the oppressors, and they came and killed the people, they dragged them from their homes and stuff. Well, now that the Indigenous like want their land back, like, they could go in grand mass and just annihilate the white people, especially those people who are around their area, their reserves. But they don't, because they don't want to stoop so low as to these people. They just want what is deserved of them. And like that thing I sent you earlier, like, it is more than likely, it's like they can get their land back. Indigenous people can get their land back without us, the rest of us, and all the colonizers, without them having to like give up anything.
And that's just the thing. I feel like minority people are almost demonized in these narratives for like resisting and trying to get some basic human respect and rights. and I think it's intentional that that's written in that way. You know what I mean? It's intentional that we are demonizing these mutants, because if they are a parallel for minority people, we are then like, I mean, we see it all the time that minority people are demonized for just asking for their basic human rights.
I think the problem with that is you're also trying to combine like this metaphor and these not ideologies, but these ideas are ways of resisting, let's say. We're trying to match that up with a narrative, like a legit, like a superhero, good guy, bad guy. There are two extremes in this situation, and I feel like the one thing that gets lost though is that you have like these two different sort of like frameworks that these mutants are executing, going at, and you just have Magneto here who is like the bad guy, who is seeing, wow, mutants are being oppressed, etc. But there's like a lot of complexity in how he's depicted, because it's easy. Like you look at the Brotherhood, and like they have clearly evil people doing bad things while also trying to resist. Like if it was on the side where it was a bit more complex in the divisions, sure. I don't think necessarily that it was this. I don't think personally that it was the intention of the writers to make minority resistance look like that, but more so it comes off that way because there's a lack of consideration as to what that looks like if you have it drawn in with such extremes of being, oh, this is the good side, this is the bad side in its execution. So that's my main sort of like feeling about that.
Yeah, you know, it's something, because if we really think about it, like, because, you know, obviously, like, they're bad guys, and, like, you know, Magneto and the Brotherhood, they do bad things, like you said. But if we think about it, obviously, like, the X-Men and the Brotherhood, they're two sides of the resistance. But the bad guy is, like, the humans. Or at least the
bad humans.
Yeah, like the
oppressing humans.
Prejudice. Yeah.
The ones that want to get rid of mutants, the good ones and the bad ones. You're mutants, so.
Yeah. But then, you know what? Because I do think you're right, Adrian. I think a lot of it, because so many things are left out, and there's no nuances in it, that it comes off as they're framing part of the resistance as evil. I kind of, because they kind of present it as integration as one thing, and then, like, we'll say violence. I don't know, actually, they present it as integration as one thing, and then like mutant pride is another thing, as if those things cannot interact. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, or like the execution, or like showcasing mutant pride is shown as blowing up shit and resisting in that way, where but again, more complexities there. And it's unfortunate that you have such a metaphor with a lot of potential sort of drawn off to be, okay, like good side, bad side, problematic side, and positive side, to the point that you are rooting for the people, or you're against the people who are still being oppressed, who are still, you know, have a good point at times, depending on the narrative. But yeah, and it's like shaping minds off that way too. It's unfortunate. Or maybe this could maybe be like a end of podcast question, but what I wanted to throw out there is, in us acknowledging some of these pieces, how would we fix it? Like, if we were able to have a seat in the writer's room, what would we be recommending in order to voice some of the complexities of the mutant minority metaphor, and then also other pieces that have been missing in the franchise to properly depict what they've attempted to put out there with the X-Men.
I think they need BIPOC X-Men, first of all.
Like more, which they've been doing more.
Yeah.
But just like using them, because I find a lot of the times they get relegated to become background characters, because even Storm is like such a strong character, but she has been relegated to become a background character, as well as you need to stay true to a character's characteristics, because I feel like they've hugely whitewashed Storm.
Yeah. Oh yes.
If you look at her before and you compare her to right now in the current run of like Marauders and stuff, she's so pale. She's lost all her melanin.
Yeah, and I think like obviously we'll dive deeper into that in our part 2, but I think that is like, because these mutants as oppressed people, you are losing like those nuances when you erase like a racialized identity. You know what I mean? I think those racialized identity would help like make that narrative more like direct and like understandable.
Yeah, like for example, some of the few BIPOC characters that they do have, a lot of them are like from, I think Sunspot is from Brazil, and then Forge is actually indigenous, and then Storm is African. So, like a lot of times they kind of erase that part of them, so you just think that like Storm is just American.
Yeah.
Because like her father I think was an American photojournalist, but her mother was African, and like I'm not sure if she was born in Africa, but like she was raised in Africa. She was orphaned in Africa, and she was found and recruited for the X-Men in Africa. But like they kind of like erase that part. And I feel like even for those other ones like Sunspot and Forge, you just know about them and like, okay, like they might be like a little darker, but that is a characteristic of them that you should highlight, not just make it seem like, oh, we're one big happy family. Like
yeah. Adrian, I don't know if you have a sort of like an answer to your own question, but
I haven't heard like a lot of like mutant resistant or mutant stories outside of like an X-Men context, but even just like another group of mutants doing their thing and just approaching it in a different way as well, and just being aware of the role of whether it be race or sexual orientation or one's own like ability, all those pieces being integrated there as well, and weaving in minorities in this sort of minority story that you're trying to depict, I think are very important, and doing it thoughtfully.
So the depiction in this mutant minority metaphor, and because they're framing it as a movie about resistance, you know, and the oppressed minority experience, they use Professor X as, shall we say, a stand-in for Martin Luther King Jr. You know, his whole thing is about safely integrating the mutants into human society. He also, you know, I think, because if you look at the work that Dr. King did, he was involved with, you know, I feel like a dominant society, we hear the highlights and, you know, the speech and the way he was killed and things like this, we hear these things, but his work, he was involved with youth groups and different groups, and like that day, even when he gave his speech, you know, there were a lot of like youth and other people giving speeches as well that he was connected to, and I think they do depict that through Professor X, because he is trying to provide safe spaces, he is trying to like encourage the mutant youth to, you know, obviously train as in like hone their abilities, and also be okay with themselves. Obviously, you know, the narrative does have a few problems, but I think that depiction, it wasn't as problematic as Magneto's, like, stand for Malcolm X, is what I'll say.
Yeah, so off the bat for me, I think that the comparisons, as you kind of alluded to, Divi, and there's like I encourage folks to just like dive in and see like the work that's out there. But it seems just like very basic at best, where it's like the most that Professor X has is the idea of like integration, and it's like very basic at that, because looking into Martin Luther King Jr., and I'll preface this by saying, like, I could do a lot more work into a lot of things that he's done historically, so this is based off of my limited understanding. But he also challenged like the way that society was going, and like was very intentional about like being collaborating with other thought leaders and challenging just the way how the society worked, and it comes to his treatment of Black people. Professor X, limited in my understanding of him too, but for the most part, he trains these mutants, he encourages integration. I think, as Anika mentioned at some point, sort of like the silencing of like your identity within while you're out there, and that just doesn't seem like he's like MLK has done that. If anything, he stands against that sort of portrayal. So, and then even on like Magneto's end, the only thing he really has going for it is the idea of the use of violence. But even when it comes to their reasons for using violence is different. Magneto, to make a statement and to sort of force the hand of mutants being able to have power in society as being stronger beings. While Malcolm X, like, he had a quote here that was like, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. Pause. Magneto isn't about that by any means, but let me continue. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the grave. There is the extreme there. But even with that, and with Malcolm X's approach, it's more complex than just wanting to be violent by any means necessary execution. So I'm not the biggest fan of the comparison, because it's just not very well thought out. I think if any, it's a bit of a stretch for me personally in sort of drawing that within those characters and the civil rights leaders. That's it.
You know, because I actually agree with you. I don't know that I would say it's a stretch. I think I would say it's an essentialization of both characters. Because you're right, like, Dr. King did stand for so much more, and he questioned the structures of society, and like, he advocated for Black Pride. Professor X wants all the mutants to be quiet, and I kind of feel like people are okay with minorities as long as they play the role of quiet, polite, obey the white man's rules.
You know what? You're right. People, okay, it's like in class, my professor, like, you know, I had the whole problem of like that racist person in class. So the professor is like, Canada is not void of racism. It's just that we have racism with a smile. And as long as you assimilate, then everything is okay. Like, you can have your cultural pride within certain like moments, but not without of that. So without, like, you can have your like one day to celebrate your cultural thing, but then outside of that, if you don't assimilate, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's very much what Xavier is about. Like, just like, okay, hush up, like, assimilate to how they are, and we'll be fine. Like, you can be mutant all you want here on these premises of my school, but once you go out there, like, assimilate.
which is so damaging. So damaging.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like because of their essentialization, okay, they're trying to match it to this historical figure, but in that, I feel like these are the nuances that they don't get. They don't think that assimilation is an issue, these white writers. It's like they want our music, they want our food, but they don't want us to speak or think or,
Yeah, because they view assimilation as like a good thing. Like, okay, like they're like us, they have assimilated. They are true Americans. They're true Canadians now. Like they're accepting us. Like they fit in.
Mm-hmm.
So like now that you fit in, like everything's Gucci.
Yeah.
Everything's good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the problem is if you assimilate, that is the problem. Like you want to be able to appreciate the culture that you're coming into, like this new land, and take up citizenship or whatever. But you don't want to lose what you've brought over.
And also, even for people born here, like, I even though Professor X is like training them and telling them, oh, it's okay, you're a mutant, this, that, and the other, I feel like he's still, the way he does it, and because of his like whole like really like assimilation like thing, I feel like he like having mutant powers is still a curse rather than a gift. And I feel like for minority people, the like assimilation is like as if your melanin is a curse, as opposed, like, we should be proud of our skin, we should be proud of our cultural identities.
Be proud of your skin, be proud of like the language, your mother tongue that you speak. Be proud of the different foods that you eat. Like, it is so disheartening to see people come and they just give up their homeland's foods and give up stuff, and they just want to eat burgers and fries all the time. That's not a shade thrown at you. Continue eating your fries.
Don't diss potatoes, okay? That's not the problem.
No, but it's like how you have flavorful seasoned food and you choose to turn your back on that, or like,
I mean, I know we were focusing on Professor X, but they do the same thing to Magneto, right? They essentialize him as like a violent character, saying, and I think that's what is dramatized about Malcolm X. Nobody ever talks about the rest of his work or his teachings. Honestly, and we go back to this like all the time. This is why there needs to be BIPOC people, especially if they're writing about the civil rights movement. If they're writing about that, there should be Black people in that room, because a white person understanding this period of time and everything that follows is a very different thing than a Black person understanding and living that. So how, they can't, it makes me mad. I'm glad that these depictions exist because those stories are important, but they could be so much better and done in such a more nuanced way if there was actual Black people in that room.
And the thing is, I feel personally that if a person is a true ally, and like, so obviously like white people can be an ally and be all for the whatever, but if you are a true ally and you are in a position like that, you should be like, well, sir or ma'am, I know somebody who's actually BIPOC who would do an amazing job at writing this story because they have the lived experience.
Yes,
like, there's room for us all, as what was her name said, like a seat at the table. There's a seat at the table for us all.
That is real allyship. Yes, I agree. Okay, so that ends our part 1 on the Mutant Minority Metaphor. Just so everyone knows, we will eventually be doing a part 2. So comment down below about what you liked about this conversation, anything you either want to discuss more, or any other aspects of the Mutant Minority Metaphor that you want us to address in part 2, let us know. Also, I just want to shout out Anika's background because it looks awesome. Okay, good, yeah. So thank you for joining us. We hope you liked our discussion, and have a lovely day, everyone. Okay.
Interested in continuing the conversation? Feel free to add us on @the Melanin Marvels on Instagram.